Welcome to the virtual Lubar Center, or at least semi-virtual. We're in person recording this, but without an audience. But I want to welcome you. I'm Alan Borsuk. I'm a senior fellow here at Marquette Law School and part of the Lubar Center team. And we are releasing the first of two sections of a new national poll focusing particularly on the United States Supreme Court and then some other issues that'll be in our second session coming up this week. And I am pleased, as always, to welcome Professor Charles Franklin here, who's the person you really want to hear from with the results of our new poll. Again, I should emphasize this is a national sample. And of course, it comes, there's been something about the Supreme Court in the news. Oh, I remember. Yes, comes, 2 to 3 weeks after the release of the draft opinion on abortion, which we'll certainly be talking about. So welcome, Charles.
Good to be here in the flesh for a change.
Yes, this is so unusual. Tell us a little bit about the mechanics of this round of polling.
So this poll is using our national sample that we do for these studies of the Supreme Court and national political issues. This is a national sample conducted online, but with a probability sample of addresses around the United States. We interviewed 1,004 respondents in this survey, and the margin of error is plus or minus 3.9 percentage points. And we were in the field from May 9th through the 19th. That is after this draft opinion was leaked. And so the survey was completely conducted after that news went around that at least this draft opinion was done. Now, I hasten to add that an opinion is not an opinion until the court releases it, but certainly the impact that that draft being leaked has had on the public conversation about the court and about abortion, and as you'll see from our numbers in a moment, public opinion about these matters is pretty substantial.
And so tell us about it.
So the quick version of this, and we'll get down into the numbers, is that approval of the court has dropped notably by 10 full percentage points between our March survey and our May survey, from 54% approving in March to 44% approving now, with 55 disapproving now. And that's important to put that in some context, that in September of 2020,
2021, I think.
September of 2020, the week before Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, 66% approved of the job the court was doing. And as recently as July of 2021, last summer, 60% approved. Now, between July and September of last year, we saw the court issue a couple of COVID-related decisions, but then, most importantly, decline to block the Texas SB 8 law from going into effect and handed it back down to lower courts to deal with. And at that point, the court also saw an even larger drop in approval from 60% to 49%. Then it rose a little bit during the fall to the low 50s before now dropping 10 more points to 44%. So over this course of not quite 2 years, we've seen a drop of some 22 points in approval of the court, and we've seen 2 episodes where approval dropped by 11 points in a short time. That was last early fall, and now dropped another 10 points this time. So whatever you think of the merits of the court's decision-making, it's clear that the public approval of the court has taken a real hit since September of 2020.
Not evenly spread across the political spectrum, I bet.
No, not at all. One of the other things that you'll see running through our results is that polarization has increased over the court, that Democrats have become much more disapproving of the court. Republicans have actually become a little more approving of the court in the wake of this leaked opinion. And as a result, polarization, which was somewhat surprisingly low in the past on party grounds, is now much stronger. With Democrats, we see a 23-point drop over this last 2 months and a 6-point drop among independents, even as Republicans actually did increase their approval of the court by 5 percentage points. So a notable shift there, but the net effect now is the parties are much further apart in their view of the court than they were even as recently as March.
How sharp is it?
Well, it's really substantial. There's a 42 percentage point gap between Republicans and Democrats now, and that gap was just 15 points in March. So we really are seeing, this sort of notable change in the difference between the two parties. And I do think it's worth emphasizing that to the extent that Republicans are generally in favor of the court limiting abortion rights, limiting or striking down Roe v. Wade, this leaked opinion motivated Republicans to be more positive to the court, even as it drove Democrats by a lot and independents by a little away from the court.
We've been doing these polls now since, I believe, 2019, these national polls on the Supreme Court. And even among Democrats, it was pretty evenly split on approval. It was actually fairly mild results, shall we put it. This time?
Well, this is where this shift is so striking. Just 26% of Democrats are now approving of the court versus 68% of Republicans who approve. That was 64 for Republicans, 49 for Democrats in March. So you might be a little surprised that as recently as March, Democrats were evenly divided in approval of the court, even as Republicans were not quite 2/3 in approval of the court. And I think we remarked actually in March that polarization on the court has been noticeably less than the polarization we see on political figures, whether that's Joe Biden or Donald Trump. The court has not had that same extreme level of polarization. Now, even with this change, Democrats are not as disapproving of the court as they disapprove of Donald Trump, nor are Republicans as approving of the court as they disapprove of Joe Biden. So we still have a ways to go before polarization reaches sort of normal levels for political figures. But for the court, which historically and in the writings from as long ago as the Federalist Papers at the American founding, viewed the legitimacy of the court and its need to have the willing support of the public. Those things have guided the court for more than a couple of centuries now, and the court has at times lost that support, at times has gained it back or even used it very powerfully to influence American society. But where we are right now, as you can see over that comparison I opened with, from a 66% approval down to a 44% approval, and this growing polarization by party, by other things as well, you see, I wouldn't say that the legitimacy of the court is threatened at this point, but the political divisions of the court have just grown at a time when the politics of our society are bitterly divided on all kinds of other political institutions and figures as well.
In addition to party identification, we asked about ideological identification.
Yeah, and here the gap between people who are liberal and conservative, or very liberal and very conservative, is even larger than the gap among partisans, between partisans. What we have this time is among people who think of themselves as very conservative, 75% approve of the job the court's doing. Among those who are very liberal, it's just 9%. So a gap of 66 points between the very liberal and the very conservative. Approval then falls as you go from very conservative to conservative, where it's still 72 points. But when you get to moderates, only 36% approve, and then among liberals it's 28, and as I said, very liberal 9. So there's an extremely sharp gradient across ideology that in a rare case actually is sharper than our gap by party. And that, I think, is part of the way society and politics has shifted with respect to the court, at least, is that ideological orientation is now driving perception of the court even more so than partisan orientation. Finally, this too is a pretty big change. Very liberal folks were 29% approving of the court in March, dropped 20 points to 9 now. Very conservative were 65 approving in March and rose 10 points in May. So again, my point, the polarization by ideology has grown substantially over this last 2 months.
Has any of this showed up in actual opinions about whether Roe v. Wade should be overturned?
And that's also really interesting. The answer is no. Attitudes towards overturning Roe and other abortion-related issues that we'll get to have barely budged. They may have moved by a couple of percentage points or 3 points or so, but these are small changes in the balance of opinion on abortion issues, even as this polarization over the court has gotten so much larger and as approval of the court overall has fallen. So for example, in this latest poll, 31% favor overturning Roe and 69% oppose doing that. But 2 months ago, it was 32 to 68. A 1 point
That's 1
difference.
point.
So a 1 point difference. And that actually has been quite stable over the course of the year. We've seen variation in both of those numbers by 2 or 3 percentage points bouncing around, but no clear trend on it. But here, having an idea of what this draft opinion says hasn't shifted people to be any more in favor of Roe or any more opposed to it, but it has had implications for how those positions affect your view of the court. And we'll get to that in a minute.
The specific case before the Supreme Court involves Mississippi law, known as the Dobbs case, and a ban that would basically end all abortions from 15 weeks of a pregnancy. What do people think of that?
Yeah, and here the public is evenly divided and has been pretty evenly divided since this case came before the court. We have this month 51% favor upholding that 15-week ban, but 49% opposed to it. In January, we didn't ask this in March, but in January when we asked it, it was 49 in favor of the law, 51 opposed. So again, just barely a couple of points, way inside that 3.9% margin of error that we have. But there hasn't been much of a trend on this either. Now, the Dobbs law implements a 15-week ban and challenges Roe's limitations and Casey, the other case that governs abortion policy, challenges their specification that pre-viability, you can't limit abortion very much. And so Dobbs has become the case that's the vehicle for overturning Roe, even though the specific statute calls for this 15-week ban. I think what we might want to point out is that in the case of overturning Roe, 69% opposed that. But on this 15-week ban, opinion is about evenly split. And so you see the sensitivity of public opinion to what kinds of limits are you putting on, and an outright overturning of Roe is quite unpopular, but a 15-week ban divides the public quite evenly.
Is that the case for the Texas law, which is not directly before the Supreme Court at the moment? SB 8 it's called. That would be a ban at generally 6 weeks when a fetal heartbeat can be detected.
And here, again, that sensitivity to when the ban kicks in is really apparent. Only 30% support that Texas 6-week ban, and 70% are opposed to it. Again, there's not been any trend in this. In January on that one, it was 28 in favor, 72 opposed. So across all three of these, you don't see any change in opinion over time. But what you do see is a substantial majority opposing the overturning of Roe, an even divide on a 15-week ban, and a substantial majority opposed to a 6-week ban. And so you see the sensitivity to the conditions in which abortion might be restricted or not.
And there hasn't been much movement in opinion on those Mississippi or Texas provisions.
No, very little. Again, it's just a matter of almost a margin of error kinds of variation from poll to poll. We're just not seeing very much on that.
Go ahead.
Well, what we do see are big partisan divisions on these issues, and that's hardly a surprise, I'm sure. But whereas 65% of Republicans favor overturning Roe, just 19% of independents and 6% of Democrats favor it. Now, that's the one case where we do see a bit of opinion changes among independents. Democrats and Republicans didn't change much on this issue following the draft opinion leak. But independents did go from 35% in favor of overturning Roe to now 19% in favor. That's the one group where we do see some significant movement. But Republicans were at 65% favoring overturning it now. They were at 64 2 months ago. Democrats were at 6 points in favor of overturning it in both March and now. So the shift in opinion that's there at all comes from this group of independent voters who did shift a bit.
You also broke down the results, and frankly, this won't come as too big a surprise, by opinion on abortion as to how people regarded the court itself and its overall performance.
Right, and so the results, again, aren't a surprise, but of people who favor overturning Roe, 84% approve of the job the court's doing now. And of those who oppose overturning Roe, just 25% approve. If we bump up a couple of months to March, go back, that was 65% approval among those in favor of overturning Roe. So that's gone up by 19 points. And among those opposed to overturning Roe, it was 45% approval in March, now 25, so a drop of 20 points among those folks. So again, a substantial shift in approval of the court, but it does move in countervailing directions. The reason the overall approval goes down is that there's about twice as many people who oppose overturning Roe as there are in favor. So while both groups moved by about 20 points, that's something close to 70% who are in that oppose overturning, and hence the net effect is the drop of the court. There are also people who continue to say they don't have an opinion about overturning Roe, and among that group we also saw a drop of about 13 points in approval of the court, even though they don't seem to be people who are closely attending to the court's abortion cases.
A curious a curious statistic that if they don't have an opinion, but their opinion of the court as a whole went down.
Yes.
Does that carry over into opinions, looking at it from the lens of the Dobbs
Yeah,
15-week ban?
quite a bit. And in fact, this is becoming a bit repetitive because we see the same pattern across all three of the abortion issues. On Dobbs, those who would like to see Dobbs struck down, that is to say, oppose the 15-week ban, went from 38% approval to 20% approval this month, a drop of 18. On the other hand, those who are in favor of the 15-week ban didn't really move much at all. 65% of them approved of the court in March, and 66%, I'm sorry, that was January, not March. So it was 65% in January and 66% now. So no change with them, and also not much change with the no opinion folks on the Dobbs issue. But those folks that don't want Dobbs upheld, would like that 15-week ban struck down, those folks did react and become notably more disapproving of the court.
And looking at it through the Texas SB 8 lens.
More of the same here, Alan. Yeah. More of the same.
I can't say I'm surprised.
Those opposed to SB 8 went from 45% approval in January to 46% to 29% now, a similar drop to what we saw in the others. Those in favor of the Texas law went up slightly by 5 points, and those without an opinion just moved by 4 points, not very much.
In my world, I would assume everybody's aware of what's going on with the leaked opinion, because I'm tuned into the news. That's what I do.
And we work in a law school.
But that isn't true.
No, it's not. And this is not atypical of even big national news stories, though for everyone that's embedded in politics generally, the court generally, let alone the abortion issue, it may be a little surprising. 40% said that they had heard a lot or read a lot about this leaked opinion, and another 36% said they had read or heard at least a little, but 24% said they had read or heard nothing at all about the leaked opinion. Interestingly, Democrats and Republicans are about equally likely to say they've heard nothing at all about it, in the ballpark of 20% or so that say that. But Democrats were a little bit more likely to say they'd read a lot about it. So it doesn't seem so much a matter of heard or not heard as it does paying a little more attention among Democrats than among Republicans on this.
And people who labeled themselves independents?
Independents are much less likely to have read or heard anything, by basically double. Whereas Republicans and Democrats were 20 or 19% hadn't heard anything. Independents are at 40% on this. And only 18% of independents said they'd read or heard a lot. It was more than double that for both Democrats and Republicans. This is not unusual. Political independents are often people who are not that involved in politics. The reason they stay independent is partly not seeing much difference between the parties, but it's also partly not being very interested in politics and not being very involved in politics. So with independents, we often see that knowledge about political events is less among that group because they're paying less chronic attention, as opposed to partisans, which are out looking for red meat to support their party every day and are much more likely to hear information and at least hear about it, as we see with both Democrats and Republicans on this leaked opinion issue.
We've been asking since we started doing these national Supreme Court polls 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, how people perceive the court as a whole ideologically.
And we see a movement on this. We ask people, where would you place the Supreme Court? We also ask about the Democratic and Republican parties on this question as well. Would you call them very conservative, somewhat conservative, moderate, somewhat liberal, or very liberal? And what we've seen is between March and now, a shift of about 8 percentage points in the share that say they see the court as very conservative. That was 15% that saw them as very conservative in March. It's 23% now, almost a quarter now. And the percent seeing them as moderate dropped by just a couple of points. But the really striking comparison is to go back to when we first asked this in 2019. At that point, this was September of 2019, only 5% said the court was very conservative then, and fully 50% characterized it as moderate. A year later, and I mentioned this before, this was just before Justice Ginsburg died, so it was the court with her on it. Still, 54% saw the court as moderate and 5% saw it as very conservative. Almost a year later, in July of last year, with the third Trump appointment to the court, Amy Coney Barrett was added after Ginsburg's death, the percent saying moderate fell to 42%, and the percent very conservative rose to 13%. But those numbers had been relatively stable through the year until now, when we saw this second move of a decline to 34% moderate, 23% very conservative. I'm not talking about those who perceive the court as liberal, though there are something like 10% that think the court really belongs on the liberal camp. That's an interesting perception in any case.
Yeah, no comment.
I should say, I talked earlier about the legitimacy of the court and its ability to convince the public to give some deference to its rulings. There is certainly an argument to be made that even as polarized as the country is, the extent to which we've seen the court as either center or maybe a little center-right may have helped the court maintain some of that support. And so to the extent that voters are now seeing the court as more solidly leaning to the right rather than to moderate positions, and if a quarter see the court, or nearly a quarter, see the court as at the most conservative level on our scale, I do think we have some reason to pay attention to that shift in perception and the role that this year's decisions, we're focusing obviously on abortion so far today, but we have a major gun case to be decided as well. And on the agenda for next year, other issues that are likely to be hot button issues. So we are going through a period in which the court may be changing precedent and in the process shifting the public's perceptions of the court in ways that have not been as seen it as extreme as they appear to be right now.
Well, in fact, let's turn to a couple of those issues that have certainly been prominent frontiers of court opinions and public opinion. For example, same-sex marriage, right. LGBTQ non-discrimination in the workplace.
These were two major decisions in recent years. The 2015 Supreme Court case that said there's a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, and a 2020 decision that said federal anti-discrimination law covers gay and transsexual workers and protects them from discrimination. Here, support for both of those decisions remains extraordinarily high. 69% of respondents said that they favor the court's same-sex marriage decision. Just 31% opposed that. And across the aisle, Republicans are about evenly divided on same-sex marriage. 49% favor, 51% opposed. But independents, 76% favor that decision, 85% of Democrats favor it. So substantial majorities in the independents and Democrats, and an even divide among Republicans on this, with the net effect of overall 69% in favor. Interestingly, on the non-discrimination against gay, lesbian, transsexual workers, support is even higher for that more recent decision. 84% of our sample favor that decision. Just 16% are opposed to it. And among Republicans, 72% favor that decision, 83% of independents, 94% of Democrats. Now, the issues of sexuality in schools and in athletic competition have become a hot button issue in party politics in the last year or a few months. And so it'll be interesting to see how that holds up over time. But at the moment, at least, when it comes to the question of discrimination against people based on their gender and gender identity, the public is really overwhelmingly in favor of those anti-discrimination protections. These issues are also relevant for the concern of some, predominantly on the left, that the logic of the decision overturning Roe could be extended to same-sex marriage or protections for gay, lesbian, transsexual people. The opinion, as currently leaked, tries to say abortion is special and you can't generalize it, but there's certainly concern by those on the left that that logic could be extended. From the point of view of public opinion here, which after all is what we do with the poll, it's pretty clear that there's a substantial majority that favor these protections for same-sex marriage and for anti-discrimination policies based on sex that I think are strong bulwarks against further change. But what the court will do in the future, what cases come before it, we obviously don't have that crystal ball working today.
Second Amendment, a case out of New York State. This should be a decision coming pretty soon on this.
I don't quite want to say any day, but by the end of June, we're expecting all of the decisions to come down for this court term. This is a case in which New York has what are these days unusually restrictive laws on the issue of a permit for a concealed weapon. They give more discretion to the issuing authority. They require the applicant to have stronger reasons for carrying a firearm. And so the court has been asked in this to rule that the Second Amendment does protect the right to carry a weapon outside the home. That would be something new that the court has not ruled on before. And here, a pretty solid majority favor that extension of the Second Amendment. 66% favor a right to carry a weapon outside the home. 34% are opposed on that. And, not too surprisingly, there's a pretty good party split. 89% of Republicans in favor, 75% of independents. And here's an example of Democrats going against the majority of public opinion. Only 37% of Democrats favor extending a right to carry a weapon. 63% are opposed. So whereas on the abortion issues, we saw a large majority opposed to overturning Roe, with Republicans more in favor of overturning it. Here we see a large majority in favor of a constitutional right to possess a weapon, and again, a majority of Democrats going against that overall majority.
Even as, in some cases, mass shootings have been in the news so much the last few years, opinion hasn't changed, including that the Buffalo incident, this horrible killing of 10 people at predominantly black people at a grocery store in Buffalo, occurred while we were in the field.
Yes, it occurred on May 14th, pretty much right in the middle of our survey. I did go to see and to check, and there is literally no change in opinion on this gun issue comparing the people we interviewed before the shooting in Buffalo to the people after the shooting in Buffalo. Opinion about gun rights, at least measured by this question, has been quite steady since we've been asking about it back to last September at least, and in national polling data doesn't seem to have shifted much in the last year or two. You know, Buffalo was in one very sad sense another mass shooting, and we've had so many mass shootings that it seems the power of one, even one as horrendous and as racially targeted as Buffalo was, those things are not measurably affecting public opinion about guns, at least by the measures we're asking about.
You did look at the data in terms of whether a household included a gun?
And here it's maybe slightly surprising. It's unsurprising that those households with a gun in the home, 83% favored extending a right to possess a weapon. But a small majority, 54% of households without a gun also support a right to concealed carry. And while I was saying that this has been a very stable opinion over the last year or so, and a little bit longer, if you go back a few years earlier, if you go back 10 years or 15 years, opinion on a right to carry a concealed weapon was much more evenly divided. Here in Wisconsin, it was almost dead even on division back in 2012. But like the country in Wisconsin, we see support for concealed carry up in the high 60% range, and the country as a whole has become more comfortable, more in favor of concealed carry. The last thing I would just add here is this is a case about the US Constitution and what the Second Amendment protects. But states around the country have, by the vast majority of states, adopted state laws allowing for concealed carry, and some allowing it without requiring a license to carry a weapon. And so here's an example where the federal Constitution has been slow to be extended by the Supreme Court on this issue, but states have used their authority concerning gun laws to move far ahead on the concealed carry issue, and more concealed carry without a permit as well.
And an opinion on the license issue related to concealed carry is pretty interesting.
And that's pretty surprising, I think. So we asked about this Second Amendment question, then we asked a different question about laws that govern concealed carry. 62% favor laws that allow most people to get a concealed weapon permit or license, but they need a license. But then we asked, what about allowing concealed carry without the requirement for a license? And there, 81% are opposed to those laws, just 19% in favor of an unlicensed concealed carry. This is an interesting number, and again reflects other polling that shows a gap between these. But we have seen states around the country moving to adopt these unlicensed concealed carry laws. Georgia has recently signed one. Tennessee has one. There are a number of other states that are moving in this direction. And it's interesting as a contrast to where public opinion is so substantially in favor of concealed carry with a permit, but so substantially opposed to it without a permit. It'd be interesting, but we don't know how much this varies in those states that have extended concealed carry without a permit. It may be that the publics in those states are much more willing to see that adopted, but at least from the nation as a whole, licensed carry, pretty popular. Unlicensed carry, very unpopular.
When we talked 2 months ago, when we last released Supreme Court-related results, the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the court was on the front burner, and even to the point that her awareness of her name was higher than for any current justice.
Right.
Justice Breyer will be stepping down at the end of this term in a few weeks, and she will be moving on to the court now that her nomination was approved. What are people thinking about her?
Yeah, we don't see very much change, and in fact, awareness of her has not changed at all. Well, we haven't measured the other justices this time, but I'm pretty confident that she's still the best known justice. Once she sits on the court and is not in the news because of her nomination and confirmation, as with all the other justices, it's likely she'll become a little less well known. But we interviewed in the previous survey during her confirmation hearings, both before and after those hearings began. What we see this time is her favorability has dropped just slightly to 39% favorable from 44% favorable before the hearings. Unfavorable is 23 now, and that's also up a little bit from the 18 unfavorable back in March. But those are modest movements, and the percent who say they haven't heard enough about her stands at 38% both times. So I think the takeaway here is that her confirmation process and her confirmation doesn't appear to have moved opinion very much about her. If there was any movement, it is a net modest decline in net favorability, but she still remains more favorable than not. She has not yet started to fade into the obscurity of a sitting justice on the Supreme Court.
Which sometimes hasn't been so obscure lately. But
in all joking aside, when we repeat the questions about favorability and awareness of the justices in our next survey of the court, which will come in July after the end of the term, one of the interesting questions will be whether any of the justices have changed in their visibility to the public in the wake of the decisions this year.
Well, very good. We will be back on Thursday, March 26th for viewing with more results from this round of polling, including a little more on Supreme Court related issues, but especially on people such as Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So stay tuned. We'll have more results for you soon, and we will certainly keep moving forward over time here with all the spotlight on the Supreme Court and with the insight that Dr. Franklin and our polls can provide on public opinion from coast to coast. Thank you for viewing.